approximately?
No, it's a rather complex issue, of course,
Yeah.
but actually, there are two answers to that question. Because learning a music instrument is actually a kind of double skill, just like learning a language.
Right.
We obviously have to learn to move our lips and our tongue and that sort of thing. But as we not only learn how to make the sounds of the language, we also learn the grammar of the language.
Right.
And that's the same, of course, in music. We have to learn to distinguish pitches and rhythms, but at the same time, we have to learn the music syntax.
Right.
And those are two different things that are learned in very similar ways, of course, but you can't approach them as one thing. You have to realize that there are two different aspects. And of course, we know a lot more about the brain now than we did when I studied human movement science.
Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting. That was actually really the beginning of the whole revolution in neuroscience. If you look at the articles and books on the brain now, they always are talking about the predicting brain.
Mm-hmm.
The brain that is thinking ahead of time what is going to come. And of course, that is not only in terms of perception. For example, is that a door, or something like that? But also, for example, in a sentence, when is the verb going to come? And of course, if you speak German, you wait until the very end. But you have these expectations in language that we call grammar, of course, and we have to learn those in a very similar way. But the basic idea is that the brain is thinking ahead, you could say. And of course, how can you know what the effects of your movements will be? How does a baby lying in the crib, how does a baby know what's going to happen when it makes a p sound?
Yeah.
The only way it can know is by hearing the sound that it makes, and the brain immediately connects this movement to the sound.
Yeah.
And this is what we call ideomotor learning.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, if you think about that ideomotor learning, it starts with a movement. In the case of a baby, it's a random movement.
Right.
But of course, any movement I make will make a sound or a feeling, or also, for example, the proprioception, the feeling of movement in your body. These sensory feedback that we get when we make movements is something that we use to learn to make movements.
Right.
And so if you think about it in that way, then learning to make music has to start with movement and not with recognition. And what we've done in classical music, actually in our way of teaching, is to replace this ideomotor learning with what we call sensorimotor mapping. We put the notes on the piano and then we react to the notes, which is actually more a stimulus response concept, which was very, very popular, of course, in the beginning of the 20th century. But it's not the only way we learn, fortunately. Conditioning. Yeah.
You found in your research also, that much I understood from it, that there are different brain areas being activated when you have a background in improvisation, for instance. So when you have this idiomotoric background, is that correct? Yeah. That there's actually certain areas that light up when you even imagine playing certain music, than if you don't have that background. And so if I understand correctly, that is sort of an area that is activated, which is similar to, as you said, like the prediction that happens in a language. So, which is funny because it reminds me that there is this very common saying that everybody uses these days, and which is quite popular, that music is a universal language. But actually, based on that, wouldn't it be that actually, in a way, many musicians that are brought up as score-dependent musicians aren't really speaking the language freely, but they're just mimicking in a way that language. Is that too daring a statement, or
no? I think you're very right. I mean, for example, imagine that I would become an actor,
right?
And I'm from some country where they don't speak English, but I want to become a Shakespearean actor. Well, then I go to England and I learn to speak British English, and then I become a Shakespearean. Or let's say I don't learn to speak British English. I practice pronouncing British English, and so that I can produce Shakespeare plays in my hometown, somewhere in Europe. Yeah, I can learn how to pronounce the language very, very correctly. If I have good ears, good ear training, good audiology, I can learn how to speak the language, pronounce it, but not really be able to converse in the language. Those are two different skills.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. And I think that we can compare what we do in classical music very much to that idea, which is also, even in singing, there are a lot of singers who don't speak Italian, who sing Italian operas. It's quite possible. And they can sing it with very, very excellent pronunciation, but don't converse with them. Because that's something different.
With German, I hear that a lot with singers, that like you hear a bunch of phonetic syllables, but you don't hear a real sentence or something.
And you can actually hear that.
And you hear, and it's like it's technically it's like that's how that syllable should sound. But altogether it doesn't make sense, and you hear it right away. At least I do. If you're a little bit sensitive to that, I think.
That indicates to me, if that is really the case, which I believe, that the whole question of interpretation in classical music is being approached from the wrong angle. Because if the being able to speak the language is so important for your prosody and all these important aspects of language, why wouldn't it be important for interpretation in classical music?
Absolutely.
And so I would suggest that improvisation is a good way. Learning to speak the musical language at your instrument would be the right way to approach it. Of course, in music, we have one fortunate aspect. We have singing. And that means that every musician can approach music from the angle of singing. And if you actually transfer that to your own instrument, you can go very, very far.
True. Yeah. But that is something I remember actually from my own study days, that actually when you would confront, for instance, a student, I didn't have so many students, but I had a few, and you tell them to, they're playing a line, especially on the organ, it is very tricky because of its by nature rather stiff sound, and you feel there's no direction or something. Then you say like, well, sing the line. There is very often a huge blockade that if people are not used to that, and I think it is so useful to do that because it immediately gives you an idea of, and especially it opens up your mind to all the different possibilities where you could go actually with such a line, with such a sentence. And I think especially in early music it is so well known, the connection with rhetorics, and you're wondering like, how on earth is it possible that we don't see that there's such a huge variety of ways we could go.